Welcome to episode 17 in our series on Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto's The Way of God. And we are still in section 3, dealing with the soul and prophecy. And we're up to chapter 3, which deals with inspiration and prophecy. And in this chapter, Ramchal is going to describe the two levels of divine inspiration. First of all, Ruach HaKodesh, and the higher level of enlightenment called prophecy. I have done a series previously on what the Rambam's, Maimonides, Mishnah Torah, Yesodei HaTorah, the section, and chapter 7 deals with something very similar to this. Chapter 7 of Yesodei HaTorah, which deals with prophecy. If this interests you, that's a great episode and chapter that is on my channel, but it's quite similar to this one. So, to recall, the Rambam, Maimonides, describes the process of a potential prophet and what characteristics he or she would normally have to attain before God bestows the gift of prophecy, and also the concept of this new attachment to God, where your soul is attached to God in a very bonded manner. And in that Mishnah Torah episode, we describe the mindset of the prophets and the stages that one must go through in order to attain this gift. And here the Ramchal describes in a very similar way. So let's hear how the Ramchal describes it. So the Ramchal begins. God ordained that man should naturally be able to teach himself, understand and reason with his intellect, and thus gain knowledge from his observation of things and their properties. On the basis of this, man is also able to infer and deduce things that are not immediately apparent, and can thus gain a more complete understanding of things. This is the natural process of human reason. God also decreed, however, that there exists another means of gaining knowledge that is much higher than this. This is what we call bestowed enlightenment. Bestowed enlightenment consists of an influence granted by God through various particular means, especially prepared for this purpose. When this influx reaches an individual's mind, certain information becomes fixed in it. He perceives this knowledge clearly, without any doubt or error, and knows it completely, with all its propositions and corollaries, as well as its place in the general scheme. This is called divine inspiration, or Ruach HaKodesh. In this manner, one can gain knowledge of things otherwise accessible to human reason, but in a much clearer way, as discussed previously. On the other hand, one can also gain information that could not be otherwise gained through natural means. This includes such things as information concerning future events and hidden secrets. This experience, however, can take place on many different levels. These may involve the power of its influence, the time when it is granted, the manner in which it reaches the individual, and the nature of the things revealed and communicated in this fashion. In every case, however, the influence comes in such a manner that its recipient is clearly aware of it. It is also possible, however, that such influence be extended to a person's mind so that he can clearly perceive a given concept without his being aware of this influence. In such a case, it is experienced like any other idea that arises spontaneously in one's mind. In a broader sense, this is also called divine inspiration or hidden influence, in the words of our sages, even though it is actually at a much lower level. True divine inspiration, however, is a clear and vivid experience to the one worthy of it, and he is highly aware of its influence. So the Ramchal, describing the concept of Ruach HaKodesh, or divine inspiration, which is, I imagine, how he describes it. It is more like divine inspiration is a kind of inflow of superior knowledge to the person's own. And he differentiates between the idea of prophecy and divine inspiration. I think you could say that the idea of prophecy is perhaps deals with concepts that the person could not naturally think of. Sometimes when you talk of divine inspiration or Ruach or Kodesh or hidden influence, they can seem like perhaps a person's natural thoughts, but they seem exceptional thoughts. But perhaps the person doesn't feel like it is something extraordinary, just that he has, by either intuition or some other effects, come up with a very, very pure thought, but probably doesn't think much more of it than that. But the Ramchal is describing prophecy and that level of enlightenment as something beyond the person's capability. If I can make a comparison, perhaps, we talk about, in the computer world, you talk about the cloud, when something is downloaded to a cloud, where you have this memory bank that is separate from your computer, for example. If you imagine the human being's a computer, and you imagine that with prophecy, perhaps the kind of effect of the information is more like God downloads information to the cloud. So it's not always accessible unless God puts it there. And then the person retrieves it through his, let's say, my analogy is a computer. So there are two very, very different types of knowledge delivery or information delivery. So the Ramchal continues. There is another level, however, that is much higher than such divine inspiration. This is the level of true prophecy. This is the degree of inspiration where an individual reaches a level where he literally binds himself to God in such a way that he can actually feel this attachment. He then clearly realizes that the one to whom he is bound is God, in a manner that will be discussed shortly. This is sensed with complete clarity, with an awareness that leaves no room for any doubt whatsoever. The individual is as sure of it as he would be if it were a physical object observed with his physical senses. So the Ramchal now is describing what a lot of the commentators on this subject describes as the true essence of prophecy. The prophetic experience is not so much the knowledge of future events. The prophetic experience is this new attachment to God directly. And the prophet, as I understand, feels it in a physical way. It is not something left to be believed or up for consideration. This is absolute knowing of, it's like Rav Kook described it very beautifully. He says, it is the point where your soul reveals itself, your neshama reveals itself to you. This is a process that after tremendous refinement and unknown other causes, God reveals a part of your soul to you as something divine, and it is like an attachment, a physical attachment, and you become guided by this new soul revelation. So the Ramchal continues. The main concept of true prophecy is therefore that a living person achieves such an attachment and bond with God. This is in itself certainly a very high degree of perfection. Besides this, however, it is also often accompanied by certain information and enlightenment. Through prophecy, one can gain knowledge of many lofty truths amongst God's hidden mysteries. These things are perceived very clearly, just like all knowledge gained through bestowed enlightenment, as discussed previously. Prophecy, however, comes with much greater force than divine inspiration, as we shall explain shortly. The experience of prophecy must come about through intermediaries. Man cannot attach himself directly to God's glory, or perceive it as one sees a man standing in front of him. The perception of God involved in true prophecy must therefore come about through God's servants, whose task it is to provide such a vision. So the Ramchal describing how you can't plug yourself in, or you can't be connected to God directly. The Rambam Maimonides describes this in Yesodei HaTorah, in an earlier chapter, I think it's chapter 2 or 3, about the certain different levels, 10 levels of angels and seraphim, and he describes the connection closest to man is something called Ishim, and the angels that facilitate prophecy. And I think this is what the Ramchal is describing here. So he continues, these intermediaries then act as lenses through which one sees the glory. What a prophet actually perceives, however, is the glory itself and not something else. The way one sees it, however, depends on the particular intermediary involved, just as what one would see through a lens would depend on the particular type of lens, or aspakalraya. There are therefore many degrees of perception, depending on the lens involved. It may cause a subject to appear far away or very close. There can furthermore be various degrees of transparency or opaqueness in the lens itself. When God reveals himself and bestows his influence, a prophet is greatly overwhelmed. His body and all his limbs immediately begin to tremble, and he feels as if he is being turned inside out. This, however, is the nature of the physical. It cannot tolerate the revelation of the spiritual, and this is particularly true when it consists of the revelation of God's own glory. The prophet's senses cease to operate, and his mental faculties can no longer function independently. They have all become dependent on God and the influx that is being bestowed. So the Ramchal describes this in a very similar manner to the way that the Rambam Maimonides describes this in the 7th chapter of Yesodei HaTorah, how the body goes through a tremendous physical upheaval when this mental influx, this metaphysical influx, is generated by God. The Rambam describes it as his senses leave him to a certain degree. I've read a lot about this, and I think that the Rambam describes it as you lose the various senses, but I imagine that the brain is the main facilitator for these influx of information, and perhaps by switching on new parts of the brain, other parts of the brain that deal with reality are perhaps turned off temporarily. This is perhaps generates these feelings of disorientation in the prophet and a lack of knowledge of time during these kind of meditative, prophetic experiences. The Ramchal continues. As a result of this attachment of the neshama or soul, it gains a degree of enlightenment completely beyond the powers of human reason. This enlightenment does not come to it because of its own nature, but as a consequence of the fact that the highest root is bound to it. The soul therefore perceives things in a much higher manner than it could ever attain by itself. One who has attained the level of prophecy is on a higher level than one who has attained the level of divine inspiration, even with respect to his grasp of knowledge. This is so because prophecy brings man the greatest degree of enlightenment that is possible for him, because when he has attained prophecy, he has attained the highest possible level of attachment to God himself. The revelation of God's glory is what gives rise to all that is contained in a prophetic experience. The revelation working upon the power of imagination in the prophet's soul, or nefesh, leading to images of the concepts forced upon it by the power of the revelation. The imagination, however, does not initiate anything on its own. These images, in turn, convey to the prophet ideas and information whose conception comes from the power of the revealed glory. The subject remains fixed in the prophet's mind, and when he returns to his normal state, this knowledge is retained with perfect clarity. This is the idea of prophecy in general. There are many degrees, however, as we shall discuss presently. The highest level of all was that of Moshe, regarding whom the Torah testifies in Deuteronomy 34 verse 10, "There will never again arise a prophet in Israel like Moshe, who knew God face to face." So that concludes this chapter. And this is fascinating. It seems like the Ramchal is describing the highest aim of any human being. If I recall, the Rambam, Maimonides, opens the chapter of prophecy declaring that God gives the power of prophecy to everybody. Every human being on the planet is capable of reaching a level where he or she can become so attached to God, can gain such a high level of perfection that you are actually physically cleaving to God, and you sense this new feeling of a mixture of your own soul and a divine element. And this divine element is now, you are subject to it in a way that previously you weren't. But with the revelation of God's glory comes tremendous responsibility to keep yourself holy, as the prophet would have been leading up to this revelation. The Rambam describes it very beautifully, the whole experience, about how the prophet is only beginning to purify him or herself. It's a fascinating subject. And in the next episode, we're going to deal with the actual prophetic experience. And I look forward to that.